As we discussed earlier, the Spanish had first encountered the tribes of the southern plains early on in the 1500s. The French encountered the northern plains tribes in the beginning in the 1600s, late 1600s, by engaging in the fur trade in Canada, which at that time, late 1600s, early 1700s, was French territory. The English, however, in comparison to the Spanish and the French, had comparatively little contact with the Plains tribes, and that not until the late 1700s, in large part because it was French territory for so long. The end of the French and Indian War in 1763 led to the French being officially expelled, their territory taken over by the English. Of course, the French people who lived there didn't necessarily leave. They just became part of, they became subject to England. So the English interactions were pretty well limited initially to the tribes just on the western banks of the Mississippi River through trade with the Mandan in the gun trade, for example, and trade with some of the eastern Caddoan Indians. And then later in the late 1700s, early 1800s, after they had taken over French territory, the British expanded their activities in the fur trade into western Canada. So they were in contact with northern plains tribes that were north of the Canadian border. But no English and definitely no Americans had really had hardly any contact at all with the tribes, the northern plains tribes of the United States. And that is going to change as a result of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when President Thomas Jefferson authorized the purchase from France of this large area in green. And as you can see, that is most of the northern plains down into the southern plains. And there wasn't a whole lot known by Americans about this area. Well, let's talk for a moment about Thomas Jefferson. In addition to the things you probably already know about him, and you may know this other stuff as well, but one important thing to recognize about Jefferson is that he believed in the agrarian ideal. In fact, he celebrated that ideal. What does that mean? Agrarian, as in agricultural. Jefferson believed, and so did people that sort of followed him politically, that the small independent farmer was the backbone of America and the future of America, and that more opportunity had to be created for people to get their own small family farms and operate independently, venerate the plow. And so that's something that he really believed strongly in, and that was going to require expansion, because, you could only have so many new farms formed on lands the U.S. controlled before they ran out of land. So got to get more land. That made that Louisiana Purchase extremely enticing for Jefferson, plus the fact that it was a really great deal. But another thing that a lot of folks don't know about Jefferson is that he was the first person to put forth the idea of removing the Native Americans of the southeast and just in general east of the Mississippi River in what then was the extent of American territory, removing them across the Mississippi River. That had been his suggestion as early as the 1780s. And he framed it in such a way as that while he believed that particularly tribes like the Creeks, who are pictured here, and the Cherokees were capable of quote-unquote civilization and were as capable of learning as white people were, and eventually would, he thought, do that, which of course demonstrates a total disregard for the civilization they already had, right? But he believed that they were doomed by the expansionist tendencies of their white neighbors, and that eventually they would be killed to take their land unless they were convinced to give up their lands and take new lands in the West. The problem was that was all theoretical because the United States didn't have any new lands in the West, and that changed overnight in 1803. Now, another thing that I'm sure you're all aware of is that upon purchasing the Louisiana Territory from France, President Jefferson authorized the Corps of Discovery, an expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, an expedition to basically explore this new territory. And they set out with a little over 30 people under their command to do just that, and eventually made their way all the way up to the Pacific Northwest and the Oregon Territory, which was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, but Jefferson had longer range plans than just this new territory from France. And as you also are no doubt aware, along the way, they picked up some more people, particularly a Native American woman named Sacagawea, or Sacagawea. She was Shoshone by birth. When she was 12 or 13 years old, however, she had been part of a group of Shoshone men and women who had been attacked by raiding Hidatsa warriors, and they killed many of the people in her party and took others, including her captive, and took her back with them to the upper Missouri area, where later she was bought by a French-Canadian trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau as actually his second wife. He had another Native American wife named Otter Woman. And when the Lewis and Clark expedition came to the Mandan villages, they encountered Charbonneau and hired him to be their guide, and they got his Shoshone wife coming along in the bargain, as well as Otter Woman, who doesn't get very much attention in the historical record. Sacagawea was pregnant at the time of this expedition. Perhaps you have heard the story that she was their guide and their interpreter, and this was true for part of the journey. Once they got over the Rocky Mountains, she, wasn't necessarily the person to be guiding them, but certainly when they got passed through her home territory and the Shoshones, she was very helpful. And what was most helpful about her, well, it was helpful that she spoke the language. Also helpful when they met the Shoshone band from which she came. Her brother was now the chief of it, so that was helpful. But just the fact that she was along and was a pregnant woman was helpful, because, you see, you got 36 armed people, armed white men, passing through the territory of all these different native tribes, and that's kind of suspicious. It would be to anybody. But those various tribes, once they saw that they had a couple of women with them, and one of them was pregnant, then they immediately recognized this was not a war party. This was a party that would be interested in either or trade or diplomacy, which diplomacy is mainly what they were after. They had been ordered by President Jefferson to try to develop relationships with the various tribes in the area west of the Mississippi. Their encounters on the Great Plains started with the Sioux, the Brule Sioux, and it was a little bit of a tense day when they first encountered these Lakota warriors, who seemed to be at least to Lewis and Clark and the people along with them, who seemed to be kind of aggressive and kind of put the expedition on edge and a little bit fearful of confrontation. As it turns out, what was actually going on is that there were 2 or 3 different Brule leaders who were sort of jockeying with one another for position and prestige. And so they were really not so much threatening Lewis and Clark as they were, as they were trying to one-up one another. And before all was finally said and done, there was a peaceful meeting, and the expedition went to the Brule village, and there was a big feast, and everything turned out okay, which is not what happened when they met the Blackfeet later on. The Blackfeet were, as it turns out, sworn enemies of several of the tribes that Lewis and Clark had made peaceful, friendly overtures toward. They also weren't real happy with strangers coming through their territory. So there was some tension when they first encountered them. Shortly thereafter, a group there at the Two Medicine River in Montana, a group of Blackfoot warriors in the middle of the night came into their camp attempting to steal weapons and maybe horses. And so gunfire was exchanged, and 2 of the Blackfeet warriors were killed. This was the first armed conflict between the United States and any Plains tribe, or actually any tribe west of the Mississippi River. And the Blackfeet were not going to forget it. They did not think very highly of Lewis or Clark or their expedition, and would prove themselves to be problematic for members of that expedition who returned to the area later. Which brings us to this guy, John Colter. Now, this is a painting that is an imagination of what John Colter may have looked like, because he didn't sit down for a portrait. John Colter, who I think was originally from Virginia and had then settled in Kentucky, very outdoorsy type. He had been a member of Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery. He had been one of their scouts. So, of course, it was his job to go out ahead of the main group and try to find water, to try to find shelter, and so forth. And turns out he was pretty good at it. And it also turns out that he really liked it out there west of the Mississippi. When Lewis and Clark were on their way back, headed back to Washington to report to President Jefferson, and they went back to the Mandan village where they had been entertained previously. Colter encountered, they met up with a couple of guys there who were trappers, American trappers, who were venturing up into the area that they had just explored. So Colter didn't come back home with Lewis and Clark. He went with those other guys. Later, he parted company with them and was an independent operator for some time, getting involved in the fur trade himself, becoming a part of initially the Missouri Fur Company that was formed in, I think, early on, maybe 1809 or so. But even before that, he spent a lot of time by himself on the northern plains and in the northern Rockies. In fact, in his wanderings, he was the first non-native person to travel in what we today know as the Yellowstone area along the Yellowstone River. And while he was out there alone in Yellowstone country, he came across this area where all this steam was hissing and rising up out of the ground. And like any reasonable person of his time, he assumed he had found the entrance to hell. And so, when he came back from that trip, told people that he had been to hell and back, literally, and because he had seen where all the smoke and the sulfur coming up from Satan's pit, and people made fun of him and thought he was crazy, and called the area, which no one had been to, and which was out there somewhere. People didn't believe him. They referred to it jokingly as Coulter's Hell. Of course, many years later, when other Americans did travel to the Yellowstone area, they discovered those geysers that the region is famous for, and realized he had been telling the truth all along, even though he may not have made the correct interpretation of it. So that was, I think, around 1807, about a year after he broke off from the Lewis and Clark expedition, who made their way back to the United States in 1806. 1808 or so, 1808, 1809, he was trapping with a friend of his, John Potts, who was also a former member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Several of the expedition members, by the way, came back to the region and worked as trappers. And while he and Potts were traveling through the area, they encountered the Blackfeet Indians again. Now, Coulter had already encountered them in between the Lewis and Clark expedition. In fact, he had killed a couple in some confrontations that he had with them, and they recognized him when they caught him. They killed the other guy and scalped him and mutilated him there on the spot. But they had a special treatment for Coulter. It was a kind of a Blackfeet tradition. By the way, I'll talk about this more later, but generally speaking, they're called Blackfoot in the U.S. and Blackfeet in Canada. I get them mixed up sometimes. But anyway, he was asked how fast he could run. And so what they did was they gave him a sporting chance. This is what they would do sometimes with captured warriors who had proven themselves to be especially brave. They stripped him naked and gave him a head start, very sporting of them, and then they followed behind on their ponies with their bows and their spears. So he ran naked across the plains and managed to dodge and avoid the arrows and even the bullets that were fired at him. One of the Blackfoot warriors did, however, overtake him riding on his pony, and so Coulter just sort of like stopped, dropped dead in his tracks, dropped down, and the horse actually went past him and the spear missed him. And so he took the spear and killed the warrior with it, and then made his escape and wandered all the way back to St. Louis on foot. I'm assuming at some point he must have found something to clothe himself with. Otherwise, it really would have been a shock when he showed up. But this is the type of stuff that Coulter was known for, that showed kind of the tenacity and toughness of him and of a lot of the people like him who engaged in the fur trade, which became a thing for Americans at this point. It had been a thing for the French for a long time in the northern plains. And then, as I mentioned, after the French were defeated finally by the English, there were English trappers, English-speaking trappers up in the Canadian part of the plains. By this time, however, early 1800s, trapping was really, the fur trade was really taking off. Coulter became the first of that group of Americans who would come to be known as mountain men. And the age of the mountain men would last from about 1810 to about 1840. A few were around after that, usually older guys, because this was just a moment in time that sort of was based around fashions in Europe. See, the fashion in Europe by the early 1800s had become the tricorn hat, like George Washington wore, like all the Revolutionary War people wore, had gone out of style. And what was in style now was this sort of kind of a short top hat made out of beaver fur. It was all the rage for a long time, and there was a huge demand for it, which meant there was a huge demand for beaver. And so these various companies were established with mountain men working for them, sometimes in small groups, sometimes individually. And these guys, much like the French Canadians were still doing, and some of the English Canadians were doing farther north, they lived out there on the plains and in the Rockies. They usually made friendly relations with some native tribes and often intermarried and lived with or among those tribes and participated in the fur trade. So here's a map showing the fur trade before 1760. You can see the blue area there that was controlled by the French. There where all their Algonquin allies were, all the way out to the northern plains. And then the British were controlling the fur trade in the area around Hudson Bay. In fact, there was a company called the Hudson Bay Company that was a very famous British fur company. And as I mentioned, once the French were defeated in 1763, the British were able to take over the French part of the fur trade. So the Hudson Bay Company basically took over what they had previously been doing, plus what France had had. And then another British company, the Northwest Company, started up in the Northwest. And so these were the two companies that pretty well had the beaver pelt fur trade sewn up in Canada. But they hadn't really ventured very far below the present day Canadian border. Here is a map showing the tribes that the British fur trade companies would have been dealing with: the Blackfoot, the Assiniboine, the Cree, and the Ojibwe, among the ones that we have discussed. However, after Lewis and Clark, there was an entrepreneurial American guy named John Jacob Astor, who had a vision, a dream of cutting in on the British monopoly on the fur trade out west. And he actually went to President Jefferson and got sort of his blessing to try to start fur trade companies. He started a company called the American Fur Company, and he became the richest man in America, one of the first millionaires in America. And he was in business for a very long time. Other companies sprang up in competition with him, including one that I mentioned briefly a moment ago, the Missouri Fur Company. And here we see some of the trapping area there of the Missouri Fur Company in the 1807 to 1820. Various forts and outposts were established that would be sort of like serve as trading posts and headquarters for the fur companies. And like I said, sometimes there would be small groups, like sometimes even as many as 20 or 30 guys operating together. And here is a close-up of some of that area in the northern plains, including Fort Mandan there. And as these companies grew, there was another company that was established about 1820 called the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Eventually, both the Missouri Fur Company and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company were put out of business by the American Fur Company, who gained almost a virtual monopoly for the American part of this. Of course, they were competing against the British in Canada.
The
And they were
Russians
also
actually
operated from Alaska
and this may
all the
surprise
way
you,
down
the
Russians, western coast of Canada down into the Pacific Northwest, although they were more involved in the otter fur trade than the beaver fur trade. And eventually they abandoned that when the otter began to sort of play out. Now, during the years that the fur trade was at its peak, there were these things called rendezvous, which were very similar. We talked about rendezvous earlier, the Native American trade fairs. This was something similar that was usually sponsored and paid for by the various fur trade companies, in which the mountain men, the fur trappers, would meet at this big sort of party-like fair atmosphere with native people from various different tribes, and they would go there and sing and dance and engage in various athletic contests, and most importantly, engage in trade. But eventually, just like the otter trade for the Russians, the beaver trade came to a slow trickle as a result of two things. Number one, the beaver being overhunted and overtrapped and becoming scarcer. But at the same time that was happening, the whole industry was being bitten by what had indeed gotten it its start, and that is fashion. Just as the tricorn hats of the 1700s had gone out of style in the early 1800s, and the beaver hats, as seen there, sported by Tom Hardy in the middle, by the late 1830s, early 1840s, beaver fur hats went out of style and were replaced by silk top hats. So all these things combined to make the beaver fur trade slow down to a trickle, which is why there were still some old-timers up in the mountains trapping furs in the 1840s and 1850s, but it was no longer a lucrative thing, and not many new people got into it. Okay, now we're going to go back in time just a little bit to the height of the fur trade and the year 1823, when something very significant happened. That significant thing was the very first war between the United States and the Native American tribe west of the Mississippi, which, as it turns out, was a Northern Plains tribe. Now, this whole thing started with an incident that took place in northern South Dakota, near what's now the North Dakota-South Dakota border, when several individuals from the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, which had only been established a couple of years at this point, were attacked by Arikara warriors who were upset, I guess, about them horning in on their territory and on their trade. And so the Arikara, or Ree, as they were called by the trappers, attacked this company of trappers and killed 15 of them. The others managed to escape barely and stay hidden for a while until the Arikara stopped looking for them, after which they removed themselves back 200 miles away to their headquarters at Fort Kiowa. Now, this skirmish that started the war is portrayed in the movie The Revenant, which stars Leonardo DiCaprio near the beginning. And if you've seen the movie, then you know, shortly after the Indian attack, Hugh Glass, played by DiCaprio, has an even worse day when he's mauled by a grizzly bear, mauled and left near death. And because his partners were really scared about those Arikara coming back, they were kind of in a hurry for him to hurry up and die so that they could bury him. And yet he clung to life, and they got more scared, so they just buried him anyway and left. This is a true story. This actually happened. Hugh Glass did not die, He clawed his way up out of the grave. If anything, I know the movie seems a little fantastical if you've seen it, but it doesn't show how bad it really was. He didn't just have a broken leg; he had ribs broken and sticking out of his back, and he crawled. He crawled until he was able to get on his feet and walk the 200 miles to get back to Fort Kiowa. So that's a very, very dramatic story where the people who had abandoned him were in for quite a surprise. But this led to military engagement by the United States Army led by Colonel Henry Leavenworth. And they had Native American allies, 750 Lakota warriors. They kind of roared through the Arikara territory and burned several of their villages. So this was not only the first U.S. war against the Plains tribe. The Lakota were the very first Plains tribe to ally with the United States Army against another tribe, which is maybe a little ironic.